I don't mind you go blank, and now it's back again. Okay. Um, the the normal way that the mind works is that it is the monkey mind. Monkeys survived as monkeys by being monkey-minded. When we think about it like that, it actually puts a good spin on it,
Mm.
that it's got advantages to it. But it would have even more advantages if it were well trained. And that's the thought that's missing. And so, in fact, part of the practice that they use in psychoanalysis goes back to Freud's use of free association. That the psychiatrist sits with his notepad off to the side, lays the person down on a nice couch, fails to tell them that this is going to cost you $600 an hour, but meanwhile, just talk. And so then the mind starts to wander. And as it does, if a psychiatrist is listening closely and knows what he's listening for, he's going to be able to put some stuff together really fast. But so long as they're paying $600 an hour, it may take him 25 years to get it out of paper because he's not about to let them in on what's going on. But he's there to make them feel better in the moment, and just sitting down and free association is part of that. Okay, so now that we understand that the mind normally free associates, so when the meditator sits down and starts to see his mind in free association, when he was given the instruction to watch the breath, he's saying, "Oh, what a disaster." Well, no, it's basically like an automobile that without AI and without a driver somehow is just going here and there and everywhere. And you see what a disaster. It runs into all kinds of stuff. But if this car now has a driver, it may have some decent purpose. And that's basically what's going on here. And so, but this needs some training. We got to catch that car first. Got to put it into a corral. Possibly a better way of talking about it instead of a car would be a horse, because that's much more exactly what we're talking about here. That a horse just goes all over the place. So the first thing we do is we put it in a corral, or maybe we even tie a rope to it. But in fact, this is an analogy that the Buddha used.
Mm.
Is to tether the horse to a post, and your post is the breath, and the horse is uh, the mind itself, and the tether is sati. And so we're going to keep dragging the horse back, or keep dragging the mind back to the breath over and over again. But if the horse is in great rebellion from it, it's going to be a slower job. So basically, we also need to make friends with the horse, which is what we're talking about in the stage of gladdening the mind. But most people, in fact, don't get that part. They've got to make really good friends with this horse right from the very beginning, or you're going to have a whole lot of trouble getting him to settle down and stay put. And that leads to kind of an interesting point. There is, I think it's in Luxembourg, but there are, this is out of an old Asian tradition of how to train horses. Now, I'm not sure how they train horses in Australia, but I know how they train them in America. At first, they put them in the corral, okay. But then the next thing they do is they slam a saddle on the back of the horse. They pop some big, heavy dude that can manage that horse on him, and the horse goes nuts and bucks all over the place. And it's really hard to get the horse to settle down. To where in this other place, and by the way, the horses that they produce are those very, very fine prancing horses that they put in competition or in parades or whatever like that. They're generally all white. I forget all of the story about it. But I do know that the first contact that they make with the horse is first off, it's in a great big barn, huge barn, not a small corral. And then the first thing they do is they feed the horse an apple. And then they begin to touch the horse. And then after the horse gets familiar with the human coming up close, the next thing they do is the horse trainer puts a small saddle, European style saddle, on his shoulder, and he walks out there and he shows the horse, look at this saddle. I've got a really nice saddle here. You want one? Then he takes the saddle off and he shows it to the horse, and the horse looks around, and then the saddle is put on the horse after the horse is completely familiar with it. Okay. The next thing then that'll happen is a young boy or child who is already part of the package and has had some training, and they trained him by putting him on a calm horse. But now they're going to train him by putting him on a horse that's never had any weight on it at all. But he's a small child. And so step by step, slowly, easily is the way they train those horses. I would recommend that you train your mind like that rather than jumping on it, strapping it down, and beating it into shape, which is normally the way that people think of doing it. Okay, so that's what we mean by gladdening the mind. Now, some people say, oh, I love metta. Metta meditation, metta, this, that, and the other thing is such a wonderful practice. And yet so many people get nothing out of it. They'll just sit there and say, oh, may all people be happy. May all people be free from suffering. You know, if you don't have the metta inside, then spreading it is just, I don't know, something that they do. But you could think of then that gladdening the mind, step 10, is another form of metta. Only now, in regards to Christianity, charity begins at home. And so giving yourself that love and that permission over and over and over again. I mean, after all, you are raising a lion. Or another way of thinking it, you're raising a king or a Dalai Lama. You're raising a huge, high-quality human being here, and you want to give him the kind of training that he needs to be a very, very high-quality human being. And so, like I said, those horses at this place in Munsingburg, I think it is, they're show horses, prancing around, to where the intention for the cowboys with their horses is merely to get them set so that they could be put to work without giving them extra training. Well, that's basically the first thing that we do want to do with the mind is get it fit for work. And Bhikkhu Buddhadasa talks about that. I don't know if you've run across that yet, but that's one of the qualities is getting the mind fit for work. And that the Buddha defines that. I don't think Bhikkhu Buddhadasa has ever made that connection directly. But when you look at what he's talking about bringing the jhana factors together. And when the jhana factors are together for that first jhana, then one of the two of the items on the list then is the applied and sustained thought, or basically that we can choose what we're going to think about. And we're also going to choose to not think about the things that are not worth thinking about. Now, in a way of speaking, this is the entire path of the Buddha, is that people will stop thinking about things that cause them suffering and start thinking about the things that don't cause them suffering or relieve them from their suffering. And if people would only take that kind of distinction and then apply mindfulness to it, the whole society would be much better off. Just that one point alone. let's not dwell in negative or harmful or even revenge or replaying anger or even replaying competitions in our mind to figure out how to win. Because when we're doing that, that's suffering. Replaying old losses, trying to pretend that they're wins, is a form of suffering, a deep form of suffering. It's the classical definition of wanting something we don't have. And so this is why when we recognize what's going on, we say, oh, well, that's that just wandering mind out there. And he wandered into a cesspool because he doesn't know where he's going. And cesspools are out there all over the place. I know because I made them myself in my own mind over the years. So, um, by learning to train the mind, the first quality that we're beginning to look at is, first off, to bring it to the anchor of the breath. But we do it in this quality of not having the mind fight and kick. This is also what we mean by right effort. That the first thing that normally will happen with a student is that they don't like the mind wandering away. They want it to be easier to do. And yet, over and over, you got enough practice now to understand that the normal state of the mind is in that wandering, hindered mind. That's its normal state, and we only are now just occasionally playing with the idea of bringing it out of its normal state. And so, if you have that kind of patience with yourself, and every time you catch the mind wandering away, it's there now. I'm so glad to see you. I found you out here wandering. Won't you come into shelter? All right. Rather than the way that normally people uh, it happens to them. I think, in fact, I mentioned to you about it at the Goenka retreat. 4 or 5 times a day or an hour sitting, the mind will wander away. But by day 6, the students is catching the mind wandering away 40 or 50 times in the hour. And then that's when on day 6, the student begins to really go crazy. This is a monkey mind. It's completely out of control. All right. But if we take this other attitude about it, is that we become quite pleased that over a course of time, we can begin to get a handle on this. We're catching it 60, 70 times an hour now. And so this is also part of the reason why we do things throughout the day. There are people still mostly in Burma. I saw more of them in Burma in my short time there than I've ever seen in Thailand. But there are those in Burma who will sit all the time. That's all they're doing. Westerners, by and large, are not intended to learn meditation so they can sit in a cave. That's not your intended lifestyle. Your intended lifestyle is to modify it only enough so that it's a playful, easy lifestyle. And so that's the direction that we're going, that into that direction of having a noble mind, to get the mind cleaned out and fit for work. So that now when the mind is cleaned out and fit for work, we can begin to choose and select what kind of thoughts, when they arise, whether we're going to allow that train of thought or not. And if we have sati, then we can keep the wandering mind kind of thoughts at bay and keep the mind sustained on the kind of thoughts that are wholesome. That's why this is such an important jhana factor, and this is what Bhikkhu Buddhadasa is talking about in the sense of making the mind fit for work. It means that it can be applied to something and kept there for a sufficient period of time so as to get some, let us say, some figuring out done. So this is basically then where we're going to be going is we're going to go through anapanasati into developing the very jhana factors that are built right into the practice of anapanasati. So we've actually now got a fork in the road of which direction are we going to go with? Are we going to go in the direction of the mind, or are we going to go in the direction of the feelings? Because basically, going in the direction of the feelings is something that we could mention and talk about, but that's something that needs to be delved in quite deeply at a later time, because the feelings are basically more subtle. Until you get some practice on it, then that's all there's worth looking at.
Yeah.
But what we're really going to do, if in fact, if we can grab that horse out in the pasture and bring him into either the corral or to a large barn, in any case, we've got to figure out what's the right thing to do with this horse, but we've got to calm the horse down and get the horse to be accepting of what's going on every step of the way. So, in fact, that's the gladdening of the mind is intended to calm the horse down. And that means that we're bringing the horse out of the feelings of freak out mode, which is the normal state that the horse is in. That's what they mean by skittish, or you can even think of it as being wild. So the mind is generally pretty wild. And the wildness is driven by instinct, and the primary instinct is fear. So what we're going to be doing with the feelings is to start to turn them around so that we feel really, really good. In the sense of part of the quality has to do with being free from fear means we feel secure. We feel comfortable. And that another quality of that is what we call satisfied. And so these terms that I'm using are actually under the term in the Pali of idiopada, which is normally referred to as the powers. And that in the Sanskrit, the word is siddhi. And in that regard, it's generally thought of as magical powers, like diving into the earth or walking through a mountain, or walking on water, all of the kind of airy-fairy stuff that comes from a magical mind rather than a practitioner. But that's gotten involved with Buddhism, and it's especially strong in Hinduism. But in the Buddhist way, Iddhyapada is actually mentioned in the Anapanasati Sutta without picking it apart. So let's pick it apart for just a moment, see what the constituents are. One of the important constituents about this satisfaction as a power has to do with success. That is very, very difficult to feel satisfied when you just had the tar beat out of you. Thinking about a boxing match. There's two guys that leave that ring. One of them feels more satisfied than the other. Which one of them feels more satisfied?
The winner.
Precisely. That's so important to think about, Ben, is that we need to add another ingredient called success. That success is actually a word that's also associated with piti. And it also is associated with attitude, the right attitude of nobility, or better still, lion. That I'm the winner here. I'm the one in charge of this situation. Now, when I use the word I'm in charge, it's not the kind of I that has to do with a self or an ego. It's just merely the language that's being used.
Of course.
Okay, it's because we don't have adequate. I can start using Dhamma language, but then I have to get really halting because it's all in passive voice.
Yeah, I understand.
So we could also say it in this way, and that would be, this is the time and the place right here where championship is found. Okay. So that takes the self out of it, but championship, nobility, that quality of being a winner, that quality of being successful, then is a necessary ingredient along with success. That is not possible to feel success when we feel like a victim. And yet, most of the time in all the societies of the world, every human being is spending most of his time in victimhood. We started that way as children. Very rarely is a full-grown lion born, especially out of the womb of a human woman. Doesn't happen. Doesn't happen. But a child can be trained like this. But an adult can train himself like this. And that's what your job is. Never mind that your parents didn't know how to train you right. You'll figure it out for yourself and train yourself. It might take a few years, but it's worth every step of the way because it's actually good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end. It's sort of like going into a restaurant, very fancy restaurant. They serve the food in a particular order. And the salad and the soup is really good. But then the main course is really good. And then the dessert is really good. Though you didn't get them all at the same time, it was still in that process and in that order. That brings it back down to then the training of the horse is that it's got to be really good right in the very beginning for the horse. And yet we fight with ourselves over meditation. We judge ourselves, can I do this or not? We want things that we don't have and continue to cause ourselves suffering rather than being really satisfied with right where we are right now. And so in that regard, these powers are actually things to be trained. And so with that in mind, now let's go from the feelings, which include piti and sukha, which are, by the way, the completion of the jhana factors. Once we have the really, really good feeling of I can do this, and you see that I in fact have moved the hindrances out of the mind, and that I'm satisfied that they are out of the mind, then that's basically why it's called rapture and pity born of seclusion, because the seclusion is being secluded from the hindrances. Doing that and having that joy, having that gladness of the mind with that success, along with good breathing now, is what's going to help get the mind fit for work. And that fit for work means now we can apply the mind to what we want to apply it to with the criteria of what's wholesome and what's not wholesome, and sustain that. Guess what? That's first jhana. By definition, through the sorry about that. We'll get over this stuff soon enough, or it'll kill us, and we'll even enjoy the last breath. So let's go through these factors again. The rapture and joy of the seclusion from the hindrances. Wow, I've been able to clean it out. May not last long, but for right now, the mind is clean from the hindrances. So those are three of the factors. One is seclusion from the hindrances. Two the attitude that we have about being really joyful and happy. So, in order to get there, we're already applying the Eightfold Noble Path with right attitude, right sati, or excuse me, right view, right sati, right effort, and then right attitude. So now by building up this right attitude, that right attitude is in fact the attitude of a lion, the attitude of a winner. And the Buddha actually mentions it as this is the first knowledge or the very first step of going into Sotapan, is that the student has the confidence that no matter how obstructed the mind can get, no matter how many of hindrances or how large they are, how stuck up they are, or in fact, how they're flavored by, for instance, physical pain, bodily pain, or let us say the grief of loss of a loved one, no matter how big that hindrance is, that we have the power to throw that hindrance out for the moment so that we can come back to the reality of the moment. We can see how things are right now. That's the first step of nobility, so that one is noble. This is the first step that is noble, that is supramundane or transcendent in the sense of lokatara, means above the world. The world is, in fact, the victim of its own mind. But here now we are the champion of our own mind. We have the confidence that no matter how the mind is obstructed, we can come out of it. So that's the first step into nobility. This is a factor that very, very few people have. Most people feel victimized. But here we're saying, hey, no matter what happens, I'm in charge. And so this is the first attitude that is a step into nobility. In order to gain that, we need to have confidence. And that confidence, Shraddha is the Pali word for it, is not faith. Maybe the faith that you had was the faith that you set down the very, very first time. But after you begin to get just the tiniest bit of success, now it's all confidence. If I did it once, I could do it again, over and over and over again. So we're building confidence. That confidence also builds on the right attitude over and over again. So this is the quality. This is why actually the path does take a lot of time. It's not like reading a self-help book, getting really high off the reading of the book for a few hours, and then putting the book on the shelf, expecting the book continue to do your job for you. That's not going to happen. No, you're going to have to continue to do the job. You have to become a bit dedicated.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
The confidence that you mentioned, what was its name in Pali?
Shraddha.
Shraddha. Is that the same confidence that's sometimes translated as faith?
As what?
Is it also sometimes translated as faith?
Can you spell that word? I'm not.
Yeah, is it sometimes translated as faith?
Faith. In Western literature, it's almost always translated as faith. But the word does not mean faith. Because unfortunately, it was translated by Christians from the very beginning. No, it does not mean faith. It means confidence, and that confidence has to build slowly. You see, faith builds slowly over time by someone telling themselves the same lie over and over and over again, hoping that it'll become true. This is not faith at all. This is your actual direct seeing for yourself knowledge that you can do this.
So this is something that you test regularly, and when you see it
It
gets
will be
wholesome
tested.
results,
It
you
will
build
be
wisdom from
tested.
that.
It will be tested because shit happens.
Mm.
And the student will invariably come by with the story, wow, a whole bunch of shit happened and a whole bunch more happened right all at the same time. And now I know that I can get myself out of it. You see, we actually have to test ourselves, but that test we don't create for ourselves. It just that's life.
Mm.
In a way, you could think of it like this: that if anything, the biggest shit of all that can happen is die. And what we're doing now, this anapanasati practice, the Dhamma of the Buddha, is to prepare for one's death. Because if you're well prepared for death, then you're also well prepared for life.
Mm.
So, in that regard, that's the biggest hindrance of all, is when you can't take that next breath. And generally, most death has to do with that when the breathing stops.
Mm.
So even if someone dies from kidney failure, the breathing stopped later than the kidneys failed. The breathing stopped when the lungs were so full of poison because the kidneys had stopped doing its part of the job of cleaning the blood. So it's always the breathing. That's about almost the last thing that goes before the brain shuts down. Even the heart can fail, but the heart getting that, and then after the heart fails, the blood the brain will shut down. So that three-way circus of the lungs that purify the blood, and the heart that pumps the blood, and the mind that keeps the blood going, which is that reptilian part of the brain back in the back that controls the breathing. When that breathing stops, that part of the brain knows it, and so he shuts down almost completely. Then this is the last of it. So that's really kind of a hindrance. So when we think about a hindrance, is nothing but just a little death, because we do, when the mind is hindered, slow our breathing down. We stop it. This is another word in the science, they call it the fight or flight syndrome. But there's a third one, and that is while we are deciding, because we've seen what happened, to flee or to fight, we freeze. And part of the freezing is not breathing. So the normal thing that happens with a human being is an occurrence that, like shit happens, the breathing stops, and the whole blood system gets filled with adrenaline, which is not a very it seems like a kind of a backward thing. You'd think that we would start huffing and puffing when the adrenaline came, but the whole point of the freeze is to prevent the predator that we saw before he saw us from seeing us. So we freeze. So if there's a big male water buffalo or a hippopotamus or something off at the distance, the natural thing to do is to just freeze, to just stop. And so that's part of our self-preservation instinct, which shuts down the breathing. So now we've come to that state of, oh no, not like that anymore. Now I have the confidence that no matter how obstructed the body can get, I can, in fact, come out of those hindrances and come to see things the way that they really are right now. Because normally what happens with that fear is, well, let's use that example about the hippopotamus. How many people in Australia are in a state of fear on a regular basis? Almost
Many.
everybody. How many hippopotamuses are there in Australia? And you begin to get my point. Most of the hippopotamuses that are actually in Australia are mental. And so when we begin to clean the hindrances out of the mind, what we're actually doing is cleaning the predators out of our mind also. And so this is an important quality then of taking the deep breath, because this is no time to shut down the breathing, because we are not under imminent attack. And yet the whole world operates like they are. In fact, when the doctor's in there telling the guy how sick he is with the coronavirus and he's hearing that, what does he do? He stops breathing, which is exactly the worst thing. In a way, the doctor's in there killing him. If the doctor would go in there and say, breathe, man, keep breathing, then he would be doing the right thing. So we terrify each other. And because of that, there's not enough breathing going on. But when we consciously breathe, when we're practicing anapanasati, so that we make sure that we're keeping the mind and the body oxygenated, then we're keeping the body kind of healthy, as well as getting the mind in a state that's fit for work, getting it really healthy. And so now we can go and look at, well, what do we do now that we've got the mind fit for work? And that is that we're only going to allow in wholesome thoughts and not allow in unwholesome thoughts. This is basically the first part of the training. You could go so far as to say that if someone's intention or goal is to go into a state of thoughtlessness, where the mind is completely quiet, which we talk about normally as the second jhana, when this applied and sustained thought settles down and that it's really quiet. The only way to get there is through the training. You can't just quiet the mind when it's just automatically noisy. We have to train that applied and sustained thought, is to start making distinctions between what kind of thoughts you're going to allow into the mind and what kind of thoughts you're not going to allow into the mind. And then as the training proceeds, we can cut that down even more, so that there's a very small subset of only these kind of thoughts are going to be allowed into the mind. And all of the other kind of thoughts are going to be left out, wholesome or not. They're going to be left out. We're going to get it down to a very, very small patch of perhaps a lot about being here now, of just watching what's going on around, feeling what the body is doing, and being in a state of here now. The mind is so focused on what's happening that he doesn't have much time to give a running dialogue about it. And then when we get it really, really closed down, that would be down to maybe a mantra. And so in northern Thailand, they normally use Budo, Bu on the in-breath and Do on the out-breath. No doubt you've heard that.
Yeah.
Okay. And you say, well, where does that fit into the practice? Well, here it is. When the mind gets so quiet that you can get it down to one word, you're making really good progress. But it's not necessarily a good idea to give Budo to a brand new student. That there's a better, easier way to train. But getting the mind eventually down to where you got it just down to one or two words. After that, then between you bring Bu on the in breath and then Do on the out breath. And after that Do is finished with the out breath, if you don't take another in breath, then the mind doesn't do another Bu. And now you've got it for a little while. So as long as you can hold your breath and hold the mind quiet, and then when you start to breathe in, then in the beginning, it'll do that. But that rarely happens to the beginning student. The really thing that happens to the new student is the Do goes out, and then they recognize that the mind has stopped. And then all of a sudden they get so excited about it that they go, yeehaw, because here comes that piti, which is exactly what you want to do. You want to get that kind of exhilarating feeling that I can stop the mind. Well, in most cases, the exhilaration and the pity actually brings the mind back into telling themselves a story about what's going on. Never mind, start again. Just keep going with it, and eventually we'll be able to control that absolute joy of the piti and the sukha that are still part of the second jhana. And that then will be calmed in the third. But let's not go that far. We've got a task right in front of us, and that is to get into the first jhana and then learn how to sustain it. And so how we sustain it now is going to start bordering it up so that we're only going to allow wholesome thoughts in and not allow unwholesome thoughts in. How do we make that criteria? Well, one of them is that if it's a past thought, that's part of hindrance. Another quality of looking at it would be if this takes me out of the state of sukha, this state of sustained sukha and piti that we have going with this first jhana, if it pulls us out of it, then that would be an unwholesome thought, because mostly what's going to happen is the first jhana is going to be temporary. It's not going to last. Sometimes it even happens in the student, because he's not watching the factors, will pass in and out of first jhana without even knowing it. But when we get into it because we know it, now the job is to sustain it. And the sustaining of it has to do with, let's not have any kind of thoughts that are going to pull us out of it, which means hindrances. Any kind of hindrance that comes by again is probably going to take us out of this state. And so now we're going to work with it in that regard. It's almost hard to see what I'm talking about until you watch the way that the Satipatthana and the Anapanasati Sutta fits together, where in the Dhammanupassana part of the Anapanasati Sutta, the hindrances are mentioned first. But then after that, it talks about other things, in the sense that without even mentioning it, that we talk about the contents of the mind in the sense of the hindrances first. But after we get the hindrances out, now what do we let into the mind? And the list in the Satipatthana Sutta will have to do with things like the five aggregates, the fivefold sense space. We've been talking about the fivefold sense space because if you're in the fivefold sense space, you're in the here now. That's the whole point of it. Let's be here now. How do we do that? Is by being in our senses rather than in our heads. And another one would be then the Four Noble Truths, which means to review. So something wholesome to do would be to think about the Four Noble Truths, but not in the sense that it would be the kind of thinking that you would have when you were taking a test. So see, you walked into a monastery and they want to know how much Buddhism you have, and so they give you a test on the Four Noble Truths. That's not the kind of way, but rather the way that we're talking about, thinking about it, is seeing the Four Noble Truths in action. An example of that would be seeing dukkha, or even a better example of recognizing that in this moment, I'm free from suffering. I'm in the third noble truth. Yeehaw! This is it. I've gotten myself out of suffering. That's the whole point of it. We're using now all of the jhana factors. Another way would be of things that are worth thinking about would be the second noble truth, in the sense of what are the causes of suffering, leading back into the five aggregates and the sense bases that the Satipatthana Sutta is talking about, right down into the Satipatthana. So the Satipatthana is actually built into the Four Noble Truths in the sense of the cause of suffering. If you look at the whole sequence, you say it starts with ignorance and it winds up with suffering. All right. Now, Right in the between in that is feelings, wanting something you don't have and grasping and clinging, or not liking something and can't get rid of it. All of that's built right into the Paticca Samuppada, but it's got various stages in between to see exactly how that works. Now you package all of that stuff together, and what have you got? You've got, based upon greed, ill will, and ignorance or delusion, is the cause of suffering. That's the second noble truth. The Paticca Samuppada is, in fact, a deeper, fuller description of the second noble truth. These are the things that are worth contemplating. These are the things that are worthwhile thinking about. But that cute chick down at the store, not so much. That car we saw with the nice new price tag, that's not so much. Those things are not worth thinking about. So thinking about the things that we want is not worth thinking about, but thinking about what we've got right now, that's worth thinking about.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yes. It's about time.
Could I use noting during that stage?
Sorry, what?
Could I use a noting technique?
This is the noting technique.
Yeah, but I'm just wondering how, whether you want me to not interfere with the noting, or whether to actually, verbally / mentally note.
The noting, there's a bit of a translation error. That noting may not be the best word for it, because when Westerners hear note, we think of things like a notepad, a notebook, stick it notes, and I'll take a note of that kind of thing. And that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about, and a really, really good way of speaking it. And so if I've told you this before, forgive me, we'll go over it again. And that is the witness. There's two kinds of witnesses. The witness who saw the accident, who saw the car accident or saw the crime that was committed, whatever it was. And then later, he becomes a witness on the witness stand. And this kind of witness is the one who's telling a story about the witnessing. Okay. So here we are now, would be, say, that noting would be like sustained thought, in the sense that this noting is telling a story about what's happening right now, which is a much, much better thing to be doing than to have the mind wandering off into hindrances. So you could say that this kind of noting then is correct thought or right thought.
Okay.
However, another way of looking at it is that the real noting will be much faster if we don't talk about it so much. So if we kind of stay more in the senses, in the sense of looking at what's going on and seeing what's going on and witnessing what's going on, to where now the emphasis is not so much on what Westerners are getting out of Burmese, is telling ourselves a story about what we're looking at. Because while we're telling ourselves a story about what we're looking at, we're missing out on the next line of the story. And so it's like this. You see it, and now we're talking about it for a while, and now we see it again, and now we talk about it for a while, and now we see it again, and now we're talking about it a while. A much better way of doing that would be, I see it, 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 I see it. That's the better kind of noting. And this is worth practicing. This is actually a skill to be developed, of learning how to note without making it a huge story. And the way that we do that is by spending more of our time then in the senses themselves, rather than in the storytelling mind. So now that you know the distinction in that noting, you'll figure out that, oh yeah, it's the whole show. That Mahasi is correct when they talk about noting. It can be an essential skill along the way, but there's more to it than that kind of noting, the storytelling. There's the actual seeing it, which is a deeper kind of noting, a different kind of noting. The actual seeing, the actual witnessing of it, rather than telling ourselves a story about it. Once you figure that out, then you can begin to see for yourself how to answer that question.
Okay.
But all of it is, in this regard, wholesome thought, as opposed to unwholesome thought, which would be the hindrances. And so coming out of the unwholesome into the wholesome is starting that process of bringing the mind to a smaller and smaller group of things that we're going to talk about. And so eventually we get down to probably just the senses themselves, and along with that, the Eightfold Path. Next time I'll talk with you about the relationship between the Eightfold Path and the 7 factors of enlightenment, because one is the beginner and the other one is the end. And that's one of the confusions that people have between the Satipatthana Sutta and the Anapanasati Sutta. The Anapanasati Sutta talks about the 7 factors of enlightenment, but the Satipatthana Sutta talks about the 4 Noble Truths and the Eightfold Noble Path. Sounds like a contradiction, but it's not. Just a different way of looking at it. And so the Satipatthana and the Anapanasati Sutras fit very, very well together, very, very close together. And it's good to almost use your book and flip back and forth between the two of them as you're looking at it, so that you can see that, in fact, this is the same practice. The Anapanasati is very clear about that, that the Anapanasati is for the fulfillment of the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And the 4 foundations of mindfulness, then, with well practices, would be then to come out of the hindrances into things that are worth thinking about. And he's talking about it from the beginning, but in the Anapanasati Sutta, he says we practice for the fulfillment of the Satipatthana, which means that now Satipatthana itself is a process. But then we fulfill the Satipatthana is there, we practice that for the fulfillment of the 7 factors of enlightenment, which means now the 7 factors of enlightenment are in fact the culmination of the practice of the Eightfold Noble Path that we've been doing all along. It's a much more integrated way, but when people were doing the translations, it was hard to see that this was all such an integrated package, partly because the language is different. An example of that is some sutras talk specifically about internal and external consciousness. And at other places, they are not internal and external consciousness, internal and external sense organs. And then they talk about it in the several of the sutras about Paticca Samuppada as Atana, or even don't even mention Atana, but they do talk about the Salayatana, and that the Western translators didn't figure out that the Salayatana is merely the internal sense organs. They figured that out in Thailand, but there's not a lot of Thais translating out of the Thai or Pali into English. That's quite a skill set. But paying attention to people who do know well, I've got a friend by the name is Robert, and he lives in Thailand, close to you. I would like for you to make friends with Robert. I'll introduce the two of you together.
Okay.
But he knows Thai. He knows it to the point that he writes contracts in Thai and English and translates them back and forth. Achan Po, by the way, has put him to work to do some translations of Bhikkhu Buddhadasa. And that he's been extraordinarily valuable to me to go into the Thai translations of the suttas to find out that the Thais translate some things in one direction, and then the Western translators translate it in another direction, which then loses the real meaning of what's going on. And believe me, the Thais have been at this thing called Buddhism a lot longer than the West have. And so trusting their translations is good, but getting available to them. I'm glad finally I've got a good friend who knows enough about the Thai that he can translate. One of the examples was in the Satipatthana Sutta, there is Ekamaga. Now, that Ekamaga is translated as, Bodhi translated as the direct path. But Bhikkhu Buddhadasa calls it a shortcut. And so, sorry about that. Santikaro translates whatever Bhikkhu Buddhadasa said into the word shortcut. And so when I discussed this with Robert, he says, oh no, that's Bhikkhu Buddhadasa's word. But in fact, that's the Thai way of translating that. That it's thy direct method, which means don't go from here to there and then from there over to there, making a two-stage. Just go directly there. And yet the Westerners have gotten so fouled up about what that means. Some of them look at it, it means the one-way method, that you can only go that way, you can't go back that way, and other misconceptions. But the Thais have got that nailed. What that direct method or the direct path means is take the shortcut. And basically the wrong way around is doing the jhanas first and then doing the vipassana. Or the other way, which is even worse, is doing vipassana first and then doing the jhanas later. Now, ultimately, that's the right way to do it, but clearly the most right way of doing it is that you've got to do some of the jhana work in order to get into first jhana. And now we can see what's going on, which is the vipassana, which is exactly what we've been talking about today, which is what we're thinking about. Means that you've got to stop thinking about the stuff that's not worth thinking about, getting the mind fit for work, getting it into jhana, and now we investigate the sense organs. Now we investigate the Eightfold Path. Now we investigate the Four Noble Truths. Now we investigate the 7 factors of enlightenment. And when I'm saying investigating, I'm not talking about you and I sitting and talking. I'm talking about while you're in that state, to do that investigation there. So this is what now we mean by the direct method of getting only enough jhana that we need in order to do the vipassana, and then that's the show. That's the whole thing. That's all that's needed. That the higher jhanas, the Buddha did, and found them unsatisfactory. Why shouldn't we listen to that? And yet you find so many. We've even got teachers that are charging $2,000 for a 10-day course to teach you up to 8 jhanas. Why? Why would anybody do such a retreat? Why would anybody want to go to a fire casino retreat if the path is the path of knowledge and wisdom? Here's why. The answer is because the Western mind has the idea more is better. and the Asian way is just enough will do. And so that's the way that we're looking at this practice, is changing that mentality around from more is better, because that's what leads to greed, rather than just enough will do, which is right up. So you can practice with this, play around with it. I'm sure you'll have a few more questions next time.
Okay. I'll see you next time.
All righty.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.